I want to talk about something most people never get credit for, not a talent they were born with. Not a skill they were handed in some classroom. Something harder than that. Something that was forged, quietly, invisibly, inside the people who grew up having to survive, rather than simply live. And here's what I've come to understand after observing this for a long time. The very traits that these people spend their lives apologizing for, the hypersensitivity, the relentless overthinking, the inability to ever fully relax, are not flaws. They are the fingerprints of a rare and sophisticated intelligence, one that most people will never develop. Because most people never had to. I've noticed that individuals who grew up in unpredictable, emotionally volatile, or genuinely unsafe environments often emerge carrying something extraordinary inside them. Something that looks from the outside like anxiety, like nervousness, like being too much. But underneath that surface, something else is operating entirely. This video is about that something else. It has 7 faces, and if you recognize even a few of them in yourself, something important is about to shift. I want to start with something that I find genuinely remarkable every single time I observe it. A person with this kind of background walks into a room, and within seconds, they already know something is wrong. Not because anyone said anything, not because there was an obvious sign. Something in the atmosphere shifted, and they felt it before their mind could form a single sentence about it. The body of the person next to them tensed slightly. A smile landed a half second too late. A silence stretched one beat beyond comfortable. And here's the part that stops me in my tracks every time. This isn't imagination. This isn't anxiety projecting itself outward. This is a neurological adaptation that was forged under pressure. Real, measurable, documented pressure. When a child grows up in an environment where moods were unpredictable, where the emotional temperature of the room had to be read before the child could know if they were safe, the brain does something extraordinary. It begins to rewire. It sharpens. It becomes a precision instrument for detecting what most people walk right past. I've seen this called hypervigilance in clinical settings, but I want to call it something more honest. Social radar. A finely tuned ability to detect the emotional frequency of a room before the room has spoken a single word. The child who had to read a parent's posture to predict what was coming. That child became an adult who reads micro expressions the way other people read. Headlines, that is not nervousness. That is intelligence, forged under conditions most people never had to survive, and it runs so deep it feels involuntary. Because it had to be. I've noticed that people shaped by hardship often describe a particular experience, one that sounds almost impossible until you understand what's actually happening beneath it. They know something is wrong before they can explain why. They know a relationship begins to feel quietly different weeks before the other person says a single honest word. A situation starts carrying a familiar weight long before any concrete evidence surfaces. Something shifts inside them and the mind scrambles to catch up to what the body already registered. This is not irrational. This is not paranoia dressed up in spiritual language. This is somatic encoding, one of the most important and underappreciated phenomena in psychological research. Trauma is not stored only in memory. It is stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the chest, the gut, the jaw. When emotional pain is experienced early in life, repeatedly, unpredictably, the brain encodes that pain at a level that completely bypasses the verbal centers. It lives below language, below logic, and here's where it becomes extraordinary. When danger resurfaces, or even the distant echo of danger, the body responds first. The gut tightens, the breath shortens, something in the chest changes. And the conscious mind is still several steps behind, trying to form the words that the nervous system has already written. Most people dismiss that signal, but they rationalize it away. Label it anxiety, go back to sleep. But people who spent years learning to trust those signals, because their survival once depended on it, have developed a relationship with that inner knowing that is genuinely rare. It is not anxiety. It is ancient embodied wisdom, and it is almost always right. Here is something I find quietly extraordinary about people shaped by difficulty. They don't need the world to be simple. They can hold contradiction without collapsing under the weight of it. Most people are deeply, almost desperately uncomfortable with moral ambiguity. They want clean answers, good people, bad people, clear rights, clear wrongs. That desire for certainty isn't weakness, it's a fundamental psychological need. Certainty feels like safety, but someone who grew up in complexity and who loved a parent who was both warm and wounding, both present and terrifying, both the source of safety and the source of harm. That person learned something that cannot be taught in any classroom. They learned that people are not one thing, that love and pain can live inside the same relationship, that someone can cause genuine damage and still not be defined entirely by that damage, that good intentions do not always produce good outcomes, that humans are layered, contradictory, and deeply imperfect, and that none of this makes life illegible. And here's what I want to underline, because it matters more than most people realize. The ability to hold complexity and to resist the gravitational pull toward black and white thinking is considered one of the hallmarks of advanced psychological development. Researchers call it integrative complexity, and it typically takes most adults decades of deliberate experience to develop even a fraction of it. People who grew up inside difficult environments often carry it instinctively, not because they chose it, because they had no other choice. That is not cynicism. That is a hard-won sophistication that most people never reach. This one comes with a price attached. And I want to name that honestly. I've seen this described in 100 different ways, but it always points to the same internal experience. When someone near them is anxious, their chest tightens too. When someone is grieving in the next room, something in them begins to grieve without being told to. When anger enters a space, their nervous system responds before their mind has even identified the source. This is not empathy in the soft, general sense. This is emotional contagion, the deep, involuntary absorption of another person's internal state. And in people with this kind of intelligence, it operates at a frequency most people never access. Here's why. When a child spends years, formative, crucial years, finally attuned to the emotional states of the adults around them, because their safety required it, the mirror neurons in the brain become extraordinarily sensitized. The nervous system learns to resonate with the emotional field of others at a very precise, very fine frequency. The result is an adult who doesn't just intellectually understand what someone is feeling, they inhabit it. And here's the part that almost never gets acknowledged. That level of absorption is deeply exhausting, not because there is something wrong with them, but because they have spent their entire lives carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to carry, and the line between what belongs to them and what belongs to the room dissolved so long ago, they don't even know where to find it anymore. That depth of empathy is a profound and genuine gift, and it has a very real, very human cost. Both things are simultaneously true, and here's where it gets deeply interesting, because everything I've described so far, the attunement, the knowing, the empathy, the tolerance for complexity, these make sense as strengths. They're sharp, they're legible, they feel like tools you could pick up and use, but this next sign looks like the exact opposite of strength. And I think it's the most important one I'll mention. I've watched people, intelligent, self-aware, genuinely capable people, build something real. A meaningful relationship, a career that finally feels aligned, a stretch of life that is actually calm and actually good, and then almost imperceptibly begin to dismantle it, not dramatically, not with a single explosion, but through small withdrawals, quiet provocations, subtle ways of introducing distance or disruption into something that was working and something they themselves built. And when I sit with people who describe this, they say something remarkably consistent. It felt too good. I couldn't stop waiting for it to fall apart. This is the sabotage paradox, and the psychological root of it is something I find both heartbreaking and completely devastatingly logical. When a child grows up in an environment where stability was always temporary, where good periods ended without warning, where peace was always followed eventually by rupture, the brain learns something that rewires it permanently. It learns to distrust calm, not as a conscious decision, not as something the person chose, but at the level of the survival brain, the ancient preverbal, deeply protective part that operates entirely below awareness. Stillness becomes suspect. Peace starts to feel like the deceptive silence that precedes something shattering, and so the nervous system does what it was trained to do. It moves toward familiar ground, even when familiar ground means chaos, even when familiar ground means undoing the very thing that was, finally, actually good. This is not self-destruction.
This is a nervous system doing its job, the job it was given, in conditions it never asked to be trained in. That is not weakness. That is adaptation. A painful, costly, exhausting adaptation. But adaptation nonetheless. I want to describe something that people with this intelligence do almost compulsively. Almost without being able to stop themselves. They analyze. Relentlessly. Involuntarily. With a depth that most people find either exhausting or astonishing to witness. Not just events, but the motivations beneath events. Not just what someone said, but the 15 layers of meaning underneath the words. Not just the situation, but the pattern the situation belongs to, and the pattern beneath that pattern. Why did they go quiet in that moment? What shifted in the room when that topic came up? What does this behavior actually mean about the structure underneath the relationship? Most people call this overthinking. I want to call it something far more accurate, meaning-making. Because that's what it actually is. When a child grows up in an environment that felt random, chaotic, or genuinely dangerous, the mind activates a survival mechanism of extraordinary sophistication. It begins to search compulsively for structure. For cause and effect. For the pattern that will make the unpredictable predictable, and therefore survivable. Find the pattern. Understand the pattern. Stay one step ahead of the pattern. That drive does not simply switch off in adulthood. It evolves. It expands. It becomes an almost relentless compulsion to understand the why behind everything, behind people, behind dynamics, behind their own responses. And here's the quiet, powerful gift buried beneath the exhaustion of it. People who think this way develop an extraordinary depth. They see things others walk past.